Guys, it's Ankit Kumar and welcome to third part of 100 JavaScript interview questions and answers. We have covered very important 40 questions in previous two videos. If you haven't get chance to go through those questions, please find links from the below description box and watch those two videos. Let's now start third part of 100 JavaScript interview questions and answers. So our next question is question number 41, which is what is hoisting? And answer is hoisting is a JavaScript's default behavior of moving all declarations to the top of current scope, means to the top of current script or the current function. In easier words, JavaScript declarations are hoisted. It means a variable can be declared after we use it already, or a variable can be used before it has been declared in JavaScript code. To understand it better, let's take some example. Conceptually, for example, a strict definition of a hoisting suggests that variable and function declarations are physically moved to top of your code. But this is not in fact what happens. Instead, the variable and function declarations are put into memory during the compile phase, but stay exactly where you typed them in your code. If we typed a variable on line number 5, it is going to stay on line number 5. But that variable or that function will be put into memory at compile phase. To understand hoisting, we need to understand what is execution context. So let's look at execution context. Execution context is nothing but the environment of the code that is being currently running. The execution context has two phases, compilation and execution. In compilation phase, it gets all the function declarations and hoists them up to the top of their scope so we can reference them later. It gets all the variable declarations, please note declared with var keyword only, hoist them up and give them a default value of undefined. Another phase is execution phase. In the execution phase, it assigns value to the variables hoisted earlier and it executes or invokes functions. There are some rules of hoisting in JavaScript. Let's look at them. JavaScript only hoists declarations, not initialization. If a variable is declared and initialized after using it, the value will be undefined. Let's look at the example. Here, if you look at the code, the first line console log num returns undefined because declaration of num is hoisted already, but initialization is not hoisted yet. Where num, this line is hoisted, num is not undeclared on the first line. It is declared, but the value of num at line first is undefined because we have not initialized or initialization is not hoisted. During only initializations, no hoisting happens. So if we are trying to read the variable, then it results into reference error. Example, console.log num throws reference error exception because there is no declaration. This piece of code contains only initialization, no declaration. So initialization will never get hoisted. So first line will throw reference error. Next rule is declarations using let and const keyword are not hoisted. For example, if we say a is equal to 1 and let a, if we try to use a before its initialization or declaration, it will not get hoisted and it will return reference error because we cannot access a before initialization here. Then example with const, if we say a is equal to 1 and const a, it throws syntax error because it says missing initializer in the const declaration. Let's look few more examples of the hoisting. Example 1, only y is hoisted. X is equal to 1, initialize x, console log x plus empty plus y. Because x is not declared yet, it has been initialized only, so x will not get hoisted. So it will say 1 is undefined because 1 is the value of x. And where y is equal to 2, we declare y and initialize y with the value of 2, so y will be hoisted. In example 2, we haven't declared anything. We have only initialized value of a and b. Value of a and value of b or variable a and variable b are not hoisted. If we try to use a and b before initialization, it returns error. If we try to use after initializations, then it returns tech talks. Our next question is, please explain difference between function scope and block scope. And answer is, function scope in JavaScript, you limit the scope of a variable by defining within a function. So this kind of scope, which belongs to the function only, is called function scope. For example, if we have function 1 and we have function 2, a is declared in function 1, there is no declaration of a in function 2, so a will not be available in function 2. Here, this declares scope of function 1. Let's look at block scope. In JavaScript, you can define a code block using curly braces. Block scope has with opening and closing curly braces. For example, the scope of first opening and closing curly braces is this. So this is scope of block 1 and this is scope of block 2. Our next question is, what is the difference between where, let and const keywords in JavaScript? And the answer is, JavaScript has three ways to declare variables. One is where, we can define where width is equal to 100. Another one is let, we can say let variable name is, let's say, height is equal to 200. And another one is const key, let's say tech talks. Let's understand where. The scope of a variable defined with the keyword where is limited to the function. If a variable is defined outside any function, the scope of that variable is global. In one line, we can say where is function scoped. We have one example in which we have two blocks, block 1 and block 2. We have where a is equal to 10 and console log a in block 1 and a plus plus and console log a in block 2. We are using where keyword to define variable a, so the scope of a is limited to the function within which it is being defined. But there is no function defined on this piece of code, so scope of a in this code will become global. Since a is not defined within any function here in this code block, so the scope of variable a is global, which means a is recognized within block 2 as well. Let's look at another example. Now we have two functions, function 1 and function 2. Since we have enclosed function 1 and function 2 within separate functions, the scope of variable a is equal to 10 is limited to the function 1 or fun1, and a is not recognized in fun2 or function 2. Let's now look at let. The let keyword was introduced as part of Async syntax as an alternative to where to define variables in JavaScript. The scope of a variable defined with the let keyword or const keyword is limited to the block defined by the curly braces. So let is block scoped and const also block scoped. Let's have a look on the example. Here we have block 1 and block 2. Instead of where, we are using let now. Since we are using let a is equal to 10, so scope of a is limited to the block 1 and a is not recognized in block 2. Let's look another example of let. Here we have enclosed block 1 and block 2 in the function 1 and function 2 or fun1 and fun2. Since we have enclosed fun1 and fun2 within the separate functions, the scope of let a is equal to 10 is limited to fun1 and a is not recognized in fun2 because fun1 is now acting as a block. Let's look at the const. If a variable is defined with const keyword, it cannot be reassigned. If a variable is defined using const keyword, its scope is limited to the block scope. It is important to understand that const does not mean that the value is fixed and immutable. It can be muted. Yes, we can change the value of variable which is defined using const keyword. Let's now look at some of the examples. First example, we have block 1 and block 2 where we replaced where a is equal to 10 with const a is equal to 10. Since we are using const a is equal to 10, scope of a is limited to block 1 and a is not recognized in block 2. Let's look at the example to show that the value of variable defined with the const keyword is mutable. You heard it right, we can change it. Let's look at the example. So we have const a which has array value which is 1 2 3. Then we have const b which has a object named hello. If we say a dot push 4 and 5, we are mutating the value of const a or constant a. We are adding two more elements to the array. If we say b dot name is equal to world, we are mutating the value of constant b. If we now console both a and b, a will print 1 2 3 4 5 and b will print name world. This code will run without any errors and shows that we can mutate the value that are defined by the const. Note that these variables defined by const cannot be reassigned. If we say const name is equal to tech const pi is equal to 3.4, const a is equal to 123, const b is equal to name hello. If we try to reassign value of name, it throws an error because we are attempting to reassign name to a different value. If we say pi is equal to pi plus 1, it also throws an error because we are attempting to reassign pi to a different value. If we say a is equal to 1 2 3 4 5, it also throws an error since we are trying to attempt to reassign value to the variable a which is defined by const, and same goes with b. Let's now look at summary of const versus let versus where. So where is function scoped? Where is undefined if we are trying to access a variable before it is declared. Let is block scoped. It returns reference error when we access a variable before it has been declared. Const is also block scoped. It also returns reference errors same as let when we try to access it before declaring it. Const variables cannot be reassigned, but it can be mutated. Our next question is, what are arrow functions in JavaScript? And answer is, an arrow function expression is a compact alternative to a traditional function expression, but it is limited and can't be used in all the situations. Arrow functions does not have its own binding to this or super and should not be used as methods. Arrow functions does not have arguments or new.target keyword. Arrow functions are not suitable for call, apply, and bind methods, which generally rely on establishing a scope. Arrow functions cannot be used as constructors. Arrow functions cannot use yield within its body. Arrow functions are a new way of making functions in JavaScript. Arrow function has a cleaner syntax than a function expression. We omit the function keyword from the traditional function in order to make arrow function. Let's now look at some of the examples of arrow functions. Before arrow function, or in traditional way of function, we used to define where get current date is equal to function and return new date. If we redefine this function with arrow function, it will be const get current date, then braces, then arrow new date. Another example of arrow function is this. If we define function greet which accepts name as argument and return hello plus name, this can be rewritten in arrow functions way like this. Const greet, it accepts name, then arrow and return hello name. Let's now compare traditional functions with the arrow functions. Let's take an example of a function which accepts a and returns a plus 100. This is a traditional way of writing function. To convert this traditional function into arrow functions, we have steps. First, remove the word function and place arrow between the argument and the opening body brackets. So remove function and put arrow between this and this curly braces or body. Step 2, remove the body brackets and word return because return is implied with arrow function already. So in step 2 it becomes a arrow a plus 100. In step 3 we can remove argument parenthesis. So we can say a is equal to a plus 100. That's how we can create arrow functions from traditional functions. As shown in this code, brackets, curly brackets, parentheses or small braces and return are optional but may be required if necessary. If you have multiple arguments or no arguments, you will need to reintroduce parentheses around the arguments. Let's look at the example. So traditional function which accepts a and b and return a plus b plus 100. In arrow function, we can say parenthesis a comma b, then arrow, then a plus b plus 100. Another example, without arguments, we say let a is equal to 4, let b is equal to 2, function return a plus b plus 100. For arrow function without argument, we say let a is equal to 4, let b is equal to 2, empty parenthesis, arrow, which returns a plus b plus 100. Arrow functions do not magically guess what or when you want to return. You need to write return wherever is necessary or wherever you want to make that function return. If the body requires additional lines of processing, you will need to reintroduce brackets plus the return. Let's look at the example. Traditional function which accepts a and b and it has a variable called chuck42 and it returns a plus b plus chuck. In arrow function, we have a comma b arrow. Inside body, it has let chuck is equal to 42 which returns a plus b plus chuck. So here we are made to add or reintroduce curly braces or brackets and return keyword. For named functions, arrow expressions like variables are treated like variables. Let's look at the example. In traditional function, we have function bob which accepts a and returns a plus 100. In arrow function, let bob is equal to a arrow a plus 100. So bob is treated as a variable. Arrow functions don't have access to the argument object. So calling the first getArgs function will throw an error. Instead, we can use rest parameters to get all the arguments passed in an arrow function. Let's look example of both. So first one is getArgs which returns an error. Another one is getArgs2 in which we use three dots rest which return rest. Let's look at the example. Arrow functions don't have their own this value. It captures or gets this value of lexical enclosing function. The function add all copies the this value of compute result and if declares an arrow function in the global scope of value of this would be the window object. So in this example, this has the value of compute result function. Our next question is what are classes in JavaScript? And the answer is classes are a template for creating object. They encapsulate data with code to work on that data. Classes in JavaScript are built on prototypes but also have some syntax and semantics that are not shared with ES5 class-like semantics. Class is the new way of writing constructor function in JavaScript. It is syntactic sugar for using constructor functions. It still uses prototype and prototype based inheritance under the hood. Let's look at the syntax of class. Let's compare this old version of writing object with ES6 classes. To define this object in ES6, we need to write class person. Then we need to define constructor. For person.self function, we need to write static self, which returns this. For person.prototype.toString, we need to write toString function, which return object person in string. For function get full name, we need to define a function called get full name and return this dot first name and this dot last name. Our next question is what are template literals? And the answer is template literals are string literals allowing embedded expressions. You can use multi-line strings and string interpolation features with them. They were called template strings in prior edition of ES6 or ES 2015 specification, but in the latest edition of ES 2016 specification or ES6 specifications, they are called template literals. They are a new way of making strings in JavaScript. We can make template literal by using the backtick or backward symbol. In ES5 version, we need to escape single inverted commas using backslash to escape the normal functionality of that symbol, which is in this case is to finish that string value. In template literals, we don't need to do this. Let's look at the example. If we want to display comma in my sentence, we need to escape this single inverted comma with backslash. In ES6 version, we can directly use this single inverted comma because of template string, and it is being defined with this backtick. In ES5 version, we need to add new line symbol to have new line in our string. In template string, we don't need to do that. Let's look at the example. So in ES5 version, if we want to add new line symbol, then I am from Tech Talks. This can be rewritten in ES6 version just like that. I am from Tech Talks without /n. Previously, if we need to add an expression or a value in a string, we need to use plus or string concatenation operators. But in template literals, we can embed an expression using dollar curly braces expressions closing curly braces, which make it cleaner than what it was in ES5 version. Let's look at the example. ES5 version, we need to add plus. In ES6 version, we can just add this with dollar expression. Our next question is, what is object destructing in JavaScript? And the answer is, the destructing assignment syntax is a JavaScript expression that make it possible to unpack values from arrays or properties from object into distinct variables. When destruction is used with the object, it is called object destruction. Let's look at the example. Variable 1 and variable 2 are the variables we want to split that object into. And this is the complete object or JavaScript complete object we want to split. So if we write let curly braces variable 1 comma variable 2 curly braces closed is equal to object, then this line will take value of variable 1 from object and value of variable 2 from object and assign those values to the variable 1 and variable 2 on left side. Object destructing is a new and cleaner way of getting or extracting values from an object or an array. Let's look at the example. If you have const employee which has first name, last name, profile and experience, the older way of getting properties from object was where first name is equal to employee.firstname, last name is equal to employee.lastname, profile is equal to employee.profile and experience is equal to employee.experience. It can be simplified or it can be done in one line using object destruction, which look like this. So object destructing look cleaner and takes a little time than the old way. Let first name, last name, profile, experience is equal to employee. In one line, it will extract all 4 values from employee object. We can use object destruction for assigning to the new variable names. And the example is, if we have const employee which has first name, last name, profile and experience, we can use destruction to assign new value to the variable name. We can say first name as fn, last name as ln, profile as position from employee. This is the example of destructing the object into variables with different name than the object variables. We can also use object destruction for assigning to a variable with a default value. An example is, we have an object same as employee. Here we have 2 examples. Example 1 is destructing the object into variables without assigning default values, which is this. And another example is destructing the object into variables by assigning default values. So this is this. If we say first name is equal to default first name, last name as ln, which was renaming the variable, and profile from employee. Our next question is, what are promises in JavaScript? And the answer is, Promises are one way in handling asynchronous operations in JavaScript. It represents the value of asynchronous operations. Promises was made to solve the problem of doing and dealing with the async code before promises were using callbacks. A promise is a proxy for a value not necessarily known when the promise is created. It allows us to associate handlers with an asynchronous action's eventual success value or failure reason. Promises are one of the best solutions to fix callback hell. Let's look at the example. In this example, we are trying to read a file called file.txt which has one callback. If we want to read another file or a directory inside this function, then inside function will also have a callback. The problem with this approach, if we have another async operation inside the callback and another, so if we have nested callbacks, we will have a code that is messy and unreliable. This code is called callback hell. So if we have callback inside another callback, then another callback, then another callback, this kind of code we called callback hell. This problem can be solved using promises, or at least we can make it look cleaner and simpler using promises. This callback hell can be solved by promises. If we use promises in this code, it will be more readable and easy to understand and easy to maintain. And the code with the promise will look like this. So we have promise read file, some file.txt, then data return promise read directory. Since then also returns a promise, then we can do .then read promise make directory, then catch, and so on. A promise has three states and it always belongs to one of these states. First stage is pending. This is initial state of promise. It is neither fulfilled or not rejected, so it is not settled yet. Fulfilled means operation was completed successfully. And the third one is rejected. It means operation has been failed. Whether operation is successfully fulfilled or rejected with an error, these two states we can combine them and we call them settled promise. How these states look like, let's try to understand these states by an example. We have a promise, we are defining promise here, so state of promise will be pending. If it is fulfilled, then it's called settled. If it is rejected, then we go on catch method. On the result of settled or fulfilled, we can run another functions which can be async or sync, or we can return it to another promise which will be in pending state again. Same goes with this. If we are in reject state, we can return it to promise which will be pending state again, or we can do some error handling on the rejection. Our next question is, what is promise chaining in JavaScript? And the answer is, the instance method of promise object such as then, catch, or finally returns a separate promise object. So we can call promise instance method on return of a promise. The successive calling method in this way is referred to a promise chaining. So we have promise on the return of a promise, then another promise of the return of this promise, then another promise on the return of that promise. This successive calling methods of promises in the return of promise method is called promise chaining. Let's look at the example. We have a promise that resolves to the value 10 after 3 seconds that is being defined like this. We can invoke then method on the promise. So p.then console log result and return result into 2. Because then method returns a new promise whose value is resolved to the return value, we can call then method of the return promise. Let's now add another promise to the then method of the first promise. So we have added another promise to the result of first then, which was this, and we have added this new piece of code which now returns result into 3. We can keep calling then method successively. Let's add one more then. So here we have added one more then which returns result into 4. If you look at graphical interface of this promise, it will look like this. So it has a new promise which result 10, then it returns 10 into 2, then it returns 20 into 3, then it returns 60 into 40. This process as a whole is called promise chaining. Our next question is, what is async await? Explain how it works. And the answer is, an async function is a function declared with async keyword. Async functions are instance of async function constructor. The await keyword is permitted within async functions. The async and await keywords enable asynchronous and promise-based behavior to return in cleaner style, avoiding the need of explicitly configure promise chain. So if we want to avoid promise chaining, we can use async and await. Async await is the new way of writing asynchronous or non-blocking code in JavaScript. It is built on top of promises, so under the hood it uses promises. It makes writing asynchronous code more readable and cleaner than promise and callbacks. We must learn the basic of promises before using async and await because this feature is built on top of promises, which means it still uses promises under the hood. Let's look at the example. If we have an example call API which is using promises, this can be rewritten using async await like this. Async function call API, then try to do something and use await for the response. Here in this function, we are using try catch statement to catch any errors that happened in any of those async operations inside the try statement. The async keyword before the function declaration makes the function return implicitly a promise. Example, get one async return 1. If we say get one dot then num, it logs 1 because this async keyword implicitly working as a promise. The await keyword can only be used inside a async function. Using await keyword in non-async function will throw an error. Let's look an example. If we have a function called return1 which is async 1, function get1 which using await, it throws a compile time error which is uncaught syntax error because await is only valid in async function. If we have another function which is async, function name is get2, if we try to use await return1, await return1 and then return num1 plus num2, it logs 2 because get2 function is async and we can use await keyword inside async function. But here get1 function was not async, we were not allowed to use await keyword inside non-async function. The await keyword awaits the right hand side expression which is this here in this case. It can be a promise to return before executing the next line of the code. So this await keyword will forcefully wait until return1 returns its function before executing this line. That's all for this video guys. If you like this video, please press thumbs up, share with your friends so that they can also get benefited, and please don't forget to subscribe to get notified about more technical interesting videos from Tech Talks and more videos on JavaScript interview questions. If you have any question, any feedback for me, or any suggestions to improve my next videos, please write down below in the comments. Thank you.